one series. I always work in a series. I like to do, I come up with an idea. Although my series has been now sort of going on, my ideas have been sort of feeding and being really for 30 years now. I always push it a little bit, start a series, and then I have at least 30 pieces to go with the series. So there are 30 paintings here, and there are 25 in this series. There are 25 of the drawings. And I'll explain to you what makes this particular series. And what I want to talk to you all about, more specifically, is how do you determine what's the right thing for you? How do you get to an image? How do you get to an idea? And how do you manifest that idea? Is I think the main thing we're going to try to talk about. But for this particular series, that's the direction we're going in. I think for me, I've become an artist in two kinds of, I think, two ways of approaching it, by many ways of approaching it. Two general ways of approaching finding your idea. And that would be you think of an idea, and then you basically administer it, or you illustrate it, or you put it together. And you have to figure out how you put it together. Or you can be an artist that is more process-oriented, where actually the process of making the piece gives you the idea. So you follow me, there are two different directions, and you have to figure out what best suits your temperament. In the old days, when I first started out, I used to have to think that I had to have a very specific idea. And then I had to basically illustrate that idea. And if I couldn't do that, then I wasn't honest. So I really put myself in this really tough situation where I was finding myself basically illustrating my ideas, and they were looking a little bit tight and contrived and artificial. And where some artists have to do it that way. They have to go with an idea, and then they manifest it. But for me, it didn't seem to work. So what I ended up doing in my work years ago was actually start with the process, and then let that process inform the ideas. And then I started to see that my ideas were continually repeating themselves, that there was something very important for me to say, and I've been trying to say my whole life. But the way I started was I started taking abstract collage shapes. Well, originally, I'll go back. Originally, when I went to the piece with an idea, I wanted to talk about nature and culture. I knew that. I wanted to talk about some kind of dialogue between the industrial and the organic, seeing through the tree. And so I would draw pictures of windows or architectural forms, columns, and then I would draw organic plants growing over them. So and sometimes I would carve them and they would come out over the sides of the architectural forms. I was very literal and I was very figurative. And so then I would have a foot or a person or an architectural form, and there would be something like that. Then I decided I wanted to sort of personalize and get my own vocabulary. So I started shoving the organic plant forms to become something either half anthropomorphic and half machine. But they would always come out of this architectural collage. Then I decided, well, I didn't need to use literal. I didn't need to put a column in there. I could take another form, such as a square, rectangular, drawn piece of paper, could represent a man-made architectural form, and I could glue it down, glue another piece down, and collage it so that it was a perfectly resolved abstract image that all something. And then within the forms, I created the organic forms, and I think you'll see that. So, for example, the easy one to see is the black one near the window. I actually collaged contact paper in that silver area, and then painted all black, and then I drew, and then I just stared at those squares, and they informed the image. Now they informed an image that I built up in my vocabulary, my ideas. So the organic form reoccurred in that. And then what I did in this piece, then it continued like that, and then instead of collaging rectangular forms, I decided to collage a pre-existing form of my own as a starting place. Man-made, for lack of a better word, woman-made, existing form, and then let it dictate. Not a rectilinear form, not an abstract form, but now there's a piece of this block right over here. So you notice I took the section, look closely. I took one of the little blocks out, printed it on, sort of arbitrarily, on the square panels or in the paper, and then let that inform the next characters, which then develops a narrative in those cases. The story, things start to happen, things start to pinch each other, or hook each other, or start flying around, or whatever within the narrative. So it was then a pre-existing art form that informed the narrative. Now, for those of you that are photographers or are trying to come up with the ideas of how they manifest it, is you have to figure out what is best for your temperament. Some of you are going to be artists that need to work out their ideas, sketch them, need to be literal about their plan, and then compose it. Some of you are going to have to find the plan through the process, because that's just going to be what suits your temperament. And unfortunately, you don't really know up here. It's through the process of doing a lot of different things. So I think for my students, I often say that it's best to work in series. I teach graduate painting now, but I taught undergraduate painting and drawing for a long time. And it's best to pick out an idea that you passionately care about. Mine is nature and culture. Yours might be something else. It may be just an object. You may decide you want to do, I did this when I was in school. I took an object and my teacher said you should figure out something that you really think is wonderful or beautiful or intriguing. And I took seashells, for example. And so I lived in Miami. But I took one shell and I would pile them all up and I would do a drawing of still life shells, be fairly literal. And then she said, no, just take the one idea, don't change your idea, but try to push the ways in which you represent that. So then I would do still life one day, and then I would just do one little space, and I would do a sort of godly grid, or then I would do another piece, or then I would blow one of them up so that you were actually looking on the inside of it, sort of Georgia O'Keeffe-ish. And then I would sort of find other artists that would have the style I liked, and I would try to take my form and make it into that, and sort of use that person's style. And after doing maybe 10 of those, you line them up and you look around, and they're very different. Each one's very different. You start to see something that you personally repeat. In spite of the fact that you're trying to be Michelangelo one day, and you're trying to be Dustin or somebody the next day, in style, you'll see something that's your own, and it comes sort of from your gut, rather than your head. It keeps reoccurring, and it's then that you start to discover what you really are more about, what your temperament is really about. And you may find that you want to take a seashell, for example, and put it in a landscape, and then have things walking around, which is sort of what's beginning to happen in my work. You might want to have that form start informing more things, or you might actually want to be much more conceptual and specific and use it as a symbol. So there's ways of then modifying the message, the idea within that context. This piece is several installation pieces that I've done. This block print was actually a small version of a very huge installation that went around the room. And it was again, I would start in the corner and I would add on pieces and go around the room. And so each piece would inform another message or another statement or another idea. And it's not to say that I don't, at some point, start getting an idea and an intention, and then almost illustrate it. I mean, it's like I almost become two different kinds of people. I start with the process, and then I see something starting to occur, and then I make it to them. I push it that way, or I illustrate that idea. But in this case, put it on that painting, specifically up there, the silver one, drew this strange mechanical duck. I think it's a duck. It's probably the one on the top. And then I took that and I made a block print of it. Right here. See the image of that character? Well, and what I did is, here's the original block print. And then inform that character. And then I put it, transferred it onto the linoleum, rubber block, print it here. Then it goes into a bigger form, and then it grows out of that. And I can see this piece get glued onto a bigger piece and growing some more, or adding on. Or I've thought about these 6 panels that I could actually deconstruct as I take these panels apart. Take one of them, and they're all about I can take one of them and make it into its own piece and add one of them. So that's the way I work. But in terms of, I'm wondering if I'm getting what they need in terms of finding their own temperaments. You all are having to figure out what you want to draw, right? Or a photograph. And how do you go about that? Do you think about it up here, or do you go out and just start shooting photographs or start sketching? Or do you know me? How do you know me? What do you got to know?
Combination.
What?
Combination of the two.
Combination of the two? Okay.
Sometimes.
Yeah. And I think that's what you have to do for a while, because you can't know who you are. You know, I used to think that to be an artist, you have to be conceptions. And I used to think that you really had to draw like Michelangelo. And I would put myself in this position of doing this, you know, and really trying to get it right. And I taught figure drawing for years and loved to draw the figure, which we can talk about how it's manifesting itself in these pieces. But I found that this was not good for me. But really, this mark, the larger mark, or the more gestural mark, was more my temperament. It took me a long time to figure that out, and it was by just doing what you're doing both, going at it in both directions and seeing what works best. Yes.
Could you talk about sort of the evolution of an idea? You talked a little bit about sort of the process, but how did you get from figurative kind of work to something that's much more abstracted? Sort of what was that process of moving from a more naturalistic view?
Right. Right.
Constructive.
Right. When I was a student, a graduate student, I did a series of people in universities. And I was cooking, because I love drawing food. And I would go draw a figure and then go back in the studio and either try to blow it up larger, change the context a little bit, or shift it, flatten the picture point so it's a little bit more cubist, so that I could somehow find my own way of saying what I felt about that figure. You know, when I was sitting in the nursing room talking to the person and communicating, I just did my best to render that person's portrait so that it would look like that. But I felt that that wasn't saying anything about what I needed to say about what I felt about that person. So I go back to the studio and start animating that. So in that, and I did a series of large prints, actually, block prints and etchings for my thesis show. But then I also started doing little paintings, little sort of memory of older people in society, on the street, a little bit more landscaping, which is what happens here. And they were much more stream of consciousness. So they had a little bit more personal sense to them. Something was telling me back 30 years ago that you don't really want to say, maybe you really don't want to do these straight prints, maybe you want to do these more personal references. And those were also the things that show. Then I went away to teach at the University of Tulsa. And all I had there was gardens and I was teaching still life drawing. So I set up still lifes. And I realized that the still lifes I would set up had an anthropomorphic sense to them. In other words, I would use melons that kind of look like masts. I'd done some drawings of food stands in Chinatown that I was intrigued by the human order and the figure that's seen in the context of other things in our environment. And so, i.e., the nature of culture. I was interested in the life cycles because of the old work. And then I was also interested in say, context within nature and culture. And that started about 30 years ago, that idea. And that's what continues to come here. And now I'm trying to figure out ways in which to talk about the anthropomorphic of the word again. And if you look through here, a lot of the pieces have to do with two characters, for lack of a better word, facing off, pinching each other, poking each other, or sometimes they're one character, like the top one over there. There's one that kind of strange, I don't know what it is contemplating its beginning. It's kind of looking over at the block print at the bottom. It's the top one of the two, the building. So, and you look around, there's often things are connected. And this comes out totally intuitively. I seem to need to talk about being connected or facing off or talking, having a dialogue with something else or with myself. Because often I do certain squares, they tend to be serious, they tend to circle in on themselves a lot. You often see fingers, things of thinking. Fingers, feet, toes. And there's certainly there's a sexual aspect to them. I've been accused of that, I can't deny it. But I think that, although George O'Keeffe would have denied it, I probably not. But it's not something I do consciously, but I'm interested in the pieces representing my feeling about my existence. And so, the way I perceive life is it's very full, very exciting, very bright. It's supposed to be fairly bright, lush, wonderful. But there's also a dark cloud, and that comes from working in nursing home. There's also the inevitability that there is the end of life. That there is death, and that's what took me to the imagination unit. The idea that there are life cycles, and that out of sacrifice or death, which is in the management, there's a recycling or a rebirth. And so it's kind of trying to be an optimistic sense about the way I perceive life. When I was in graduate school, I didn't think a whole lot about aging until I wrote the person. And then I thought a whole lot more about where we're going, what we're doing, and what makes life most important. And I think without aging and without death at the other end, I think we would all be bored, and we'd all think, wow, this is forever. But we have this attitude that we got to get on with it because it's a finite period of time. So that's, I think the figure keeps reoccurring because I want it to be not only about plants and machines, but about possibly characters that have occurred. I've been accused in some of the critics have written about my work that especially the big pieces, that they were Rube Goldbergian contraptions. Most of them have known Rube Goldberg, but it's that Rube Goldbergian contraption or machine that we have made and we've lost control. And so this is and there tends to be a thread in this 30 years of my work. You see my slides, there's an see that this is going to change, been the same thing for a long time, that we may be in fact doing something to our environment. We may be creating a monster. We think we're doing great stuff with technology and creating these machines, but then who's winning out? Is the machine now winning out? And if you look at these more closely, you can't really tell whether it's half human way and half machine and who's in control. Another critic equated me to, she said, standing in one of my installations with large pieces, she there was reminding her of Matrix and Fantasia, which is great, it's a contemporary thing. But she said it was, in Fantasia, it was like Mickey, most of you have probably seen it or heard it about Fantasia, but Mickey gets put into a trance in the castle by a magician, and he's told that he has to clean the whole castle by the end of the day. And so he puts a spell on one lump and one bucket and makes them into thousands of lumps and buckets. And then they start cleaning and pouring water, and then producing water flooding down the steps, and he's lost complete control. And she felt that what is happening is that there's this kind of, what seems to be whimsical dialogue going on here, that we're creating some kind of system that then maybe is turning on us, maybe is controlling us. And so that seems to be a thing. But how you get to these ideas is that it sort of happens through a lot of work, a lot of drawing, a lot of thinking, a lot of pushing the idea, starting with something that seems to matter to you, experimenting with it until you figure out what it really says, what you want to say. And you don't, like I didn't really understand what it was I kept trying to say at first. I kept going series after series, and it really often took someone else to look at the work to say, wow, you just keep repeating this one theme over and over. And looking back at my slides, I realized that even with the old people in nursing homes, the themes were still there. The institution, immutability, life cycles, turning in on itself, were all the things that are now associated with this work. And I wouldn't necessarily be aware of it at the time. Because there's nothing harder than coming up with an idea and then figuring out how to manage and how it fits with your time. Yeah.
It sounds like you continue to develop the interpretation of your own work. Maybe that's really obvious, but I'm not sure that all times you would do that. I mean, I might find closure. This is about this. This idea is summed up this way. But it seems like your interpretation of your own work is developing. That's the process.
I think that's true, and I think I'm capable of interpreting more now after the fact than while I'm actually doing it. And I think that's important for the group to know that you shouldn't go to a work of art with an interpretation before you start. Because that's dead. And that's when you start repeating yourself or redoing yourself. But what you need to do is almost shut off your brain and intuitively do something. And then it's an after fact that you actually see that you're doing the same thing. I think you're right, but I can be articulate now or talk about what I've been doing, but it's not always apparent when I'm actually doing these. Because when these started, they just changed a little bit, where there's more landscape orientation than these earlier pieces. And I was kind of surprised by that. I didn't plan it. I think you're right about that it's not really an interpretation of your work, and that everyone is different. But I think that everyone has a particular voice or way of seeing that they can't be aware of on the left side of their brain. They can only be aware of it through the process of doing lots of work. And I would think even in photography, you're drawn to shoot images of certain things, and that's things that matter to you, as an artist. And that you listen to. Because if you shut off that and start trying to force yourself into areas that aren't so important to you on a gut level, then may end up being feeling like someone else's work or control. So I think it's not the interpretation that I'm wanting to look for. It's finding the voice, finding their eye. What are you attracted to, and Because if I think if we go to the museum and we look at a lot of artists, and I did this when I was younger, which you have to do, but you tend to say, oh, I really like Bryce art. You know, I really like this abstract forms, I really like this conceptual work, I want to do all of those things. And you find out that, wait, you can like them and admire them and learn from them, but they might not necessarily be yours. So like looking at other photographers, you could really love the way in which someone photographs, but maybe the content is not necessarily suited. So I guess, is that making it clear? Which I'm glad you pointed that out, because I'm thinking that I'm making myself sound too interpretive with what it's at.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of times artists is after their thoughts.
Yeah, it should
And
be.
you're also showing how much critics interpretation of work and other artists' interpretation is enriching your own interpretation. You're seeing, and in critiques we see that happening where, another student will have an interpretation of a photograph that
Right.
the photographer didn't well,
Yeah.
see,
Yeah.
but you just open that, consider it, you can take, and have you
Well,
wish a little further.
Yeah, but the interpretation of the critics was, I liked it because it was exactly what I thought. I'm interested in deja vu, I'm interested in nature and culture and who's winning out. And when she picked up on the fact, when both of them picked up on the fact that we have developed something that we lost control of, was exactly what I was hoping. Yeah, and then in that sense, their comments didn't influence me as much as I was just glad I got what I thought I was doing. What I was looking for, in the work. But I often like to ask students whether or not, and probably should ask them before I tell them, but I often ask students when they come to the studio, whether they find the work threatening, disquieting, funny, both. Do they have any subliminal references of their own? Do they think they've been there before? Deja vu? I mean, just what do you get when you come in here and think, whoa, these are weird? Because that's important. Because I'm so close to them. I know what I get. So, a couple of things back here.
Could you talk just briefly about the process of starting a meetings like this? Could you talk us through a little bit? You got the big blank sheets of paper.
Okay.
How do you proceed?
Okay. And then also they have time, they can look at the video and they can actually see how it developed. Because this kind of piece is important that it's supposed to be sort of a participatory piece where the group can watch the choices or even suggest moving things around in the early stages. Or in fact, if we had more time, if I could be here longer, I could see taking this apart and maybe lining all six of them up and putting the paper in between them and then, or having students reshuffle them, leaving the spaces and then leaving them alone and maybe resolve it compositionally, formally. So it's a deconstructing. It's like taking a piece of this, putting it over there. I would like to see them take a piece of this, put it over there, and maybe do something. I had a dealer who I painted in the show in the gallery in New York. I painted the wall with like slate paint, and I drew on it with chalk, and then I asked him to erase it with a sponge, and I parts of it, and then totally arbitrarily. And I came back in this day in the gallery and had to redraw that part into something else. So he's the destructive force, the Dionysian, sort of killing and sacrificing. This one, what I did, and you can see the video earlier, what I did was I took my pieces of paper, which were my architectural references, this corner piece of paper, this one here, and I had a pre-existing rock print, which was over here. And I started, and you can see in there, I started just trying to find interesting places for them so that if once people were interested back abstractly, does this weight you see a ladder and the ladder is leaning at a diagonal, you got to go over there and start straightening it up. You see a picture hanging along like this, we go over and straighten it up. So psychologically, we're all set the idea, and it's using the compositional knowledge, that if I put a lot of diagonals in there, and don't count diagonals, and don't have any verticals and horizontals, then structurally it's going to stand. And my viewers could toss their cookies and go running into the room. So when I'm moving these things around, I do take in compositional statistics or forms, and is that waiting on this side is psychologically you can taught on the right hand side of the head. So I started my way over here. I also structured actually the pieces in grid. I started with white pieces of paper in grid, and then I got, you see, have applied horizontals going through the whole piece. Before I even start the drawing part, there are applied horizontals. Then I collage the pieces. Let's see if you can see the horizontal. You can see where I continue the landscape here with the bottom of that gray. And you can see, step back just to stand this up. You can see the obvious on the paper. And this is an applied horizontal on the bottom. I'm now in the wrong. I know it across the bottom. But you can also see that usually joint lines up with something else or some other little thing that really subtle little dotted coming across. So really, if you examine this closely, you will see lots of applied horizontals going through, picking up here. And yesterday I just picked it up over here someplace. So that it doesn't have to be exact, but you can see this one, you can see this guy lines up on that. It's really here. And so all the way through, and then you start doing it vertical. And when I'm first drawing, it's intuitive. I don't think, oh, okay, where's this thing to go? But I have a sense of where it wants to go, and then I might come back to my senses. Back to reality, it's, oh, I can put it up just a little bit, and it will really line up. But most of the time when I'm drawing, it should be you're in a trance, you're losing yourself in the process. And then when I started this character right here, it was to imply diagonals. And I can roll these diagonals this way now. And if you look very carefully, I have a diagonal going this way. And now, if I only had diagonals in one direction, the whole thing was gone. But I'm kind of cheating because I've been working with the grid system and all of these things are lining up. That when I do start a diagonal, and it relates to the collage shapes, which are already set. I set and I put the collage on without anything else proceeding. I had this diagonal came up through and hit the base of these and went up there. And then if you trying to take the paper pieces, this was a diagonal, wrong diagonal before it came through here, and then the corner of that. So just in the collage pieces that were already corners. And then so I'm already set, and then I have just my drawing of what corresponds to it. And then this guy came and diagonal, and all these, and this kind of thrust right here, goes all the way up. I think you'll see it here again. Before we put the video or something, I'm saying pictures of the morning, and sometimes before we're going your figure drawing class. And so we're going to talk a little bit about figure reference in the work. And for the more advanced students there, I've given you, passed out a sheet of the original proposal for the Japanese instructions. And then maybe you should look at it. I want to talk about that. Sort of how I got to, so maybe we should start talking straight out about the figure reference in the work.
Yeah, I think how you
Rather than
you started with your training.
Right, it's not very correct. My background is in figure is basically as a figure artist, and I started out thinking about myself as an artist and thinking that I should be able to draw from the original. And this preconception of what an artist I really went through a lot of training and really tough stuff and went to classes to draw very organizational. Figured it would be better. I discovered along the way that that particular style of art was not suited for my temperament. I don't like to do this, I like to do this, or this. And so I had to learn through the process of a lot of drawing, but really suited my temperament. You know, I love that kind of drawing, being what I meant to do. So I think for all of you who are learning when you're on the drawing, you're probably also in the process of figuring out how you like to draw, and what way you like to draw the figure. But I think figure drawing early on is really important because it informs all of the other drawing. I think the better you get, the more experience you have in figure drawing, the more easily you'll be able to create your own images in the future and define your own identity, your own vocabulary. So I always advocate gather as much information in figure drawing as possible. Just do it all the time. And then I taught for many years, and so I taught figure drawing. And so would often have to draw a figure with the students to show them how to get a certain space or how to do a foreshortening or whatever. And then also helping them with their drawings was the same as me in my own brain having to draw them. So having a wonderful figure and making those references and what does the form really do in front of me. I think informed me over the years so that now when I draw, I know how to draw a form, foreshortening form or whatever, because I've had so much experience with students and my own drawing. So, and the figure was always important to me at the beginning of my career, and when I was a graduate student, I was told I should do a series, work on a series. And so, to find my own identity. And so I chose to go to a local nursing home because they were asking me to do portraits of the people in the nursing home. So I definitely thought it was a really interesting kind of a political, social reference, and also opportunity to draw a figure and a model. And what I would do is I'd go in and sit with people and draw their portrait. And try to be very, very accurate. And I was more interested in being accurate than a person drawing feelings about it. Then I'd go back to the studio and want to somehow abstract the image enough or give it a cubist reference or a surrealist reference to kind of try to find my own feelings about the person rather than simply rendering. So I did this series as a graduate student after graduate school, which I didn't mention in the last class. After graduate school, I got a grant to the kids in the homeschools. And again, the social political reference, the opportunity to spend time with an individual, finding out about the life, about the play, and life cycles, which I was also getting elderly, but I was also seeing the kind of life cycle of younger people that were in prison. So it was kind of the same kind of turning in on itself, it's the beginning versus the end, in life cycles. And then I would Xerox copies of the kids in the homeschools. We have a great Xerox machine. Give them all copies of portraits of themselves. And then they would send them to their girlfriends or girlfriends or family. And I would go back and then change and abstract things as well. And try to compute it for the person's feelings about that husband. And then later I went to teach at the University of Tulsa and I taught St.Olaf, studying St.Olaf. So I found that even though I didn't have the figure anymore, I did teach figure drawing as well. For the students, I then set up the St.Olaf at home in the studio, and when this didn't have nursing home or homeschools, I started doing St.Olafs, but they were imbued with anthropomorphic forms. In other words, I found myself putting melons in that were sliced that kind of looked like masks or faces, and boxes that were dark on the inside and had two holes in the back, and I realized that they looked like masks. So, and then shadows that were cast by plants kind of looked like the figure, sort of like a Goya-esque kind of figure. And I realized that I was setting up my still lifes inanimate objects in a very anthropomorphic way and making these There are 30 pages, little pages like this in the series, and there are 25 drawings, so we only sent 6 here. So we need a little more space. And then I did this little series more recently of torn pieces of block print, and the book are torn pieces of the block print, elongated, and then the stories are created. So which gets me to my present theme, and then, which is taking all of this nature culture, the industry, world environment, and the environment, and the facing off, has been the theme. The life cycles has been the theme. Right now, it's trying to be represented a couple ways. Early on, it used to be I always drew a column and then drew a plant and looked like a figure. Sometimes the plants, the leaves look like hands growing out over the column. So there was an architectural form, which was called man-made institutional form. And then there was always a plant or a figure, which was an organic form. So there was always a dialogue between nature and culture. Man-made and the environment. Who's doing it? Sometimes the plants grow over the columns and filled out onto the wall, and I sculpted those. And sometimes they get contained. They're contained in a box. And I would just do it before. Then I said, I don't need the column. I don't have to be so literal. I don't have to. But I'm looking for my own vocabulary. I can just put a rectangle or torn piece of paper to represent my man-made architectural form. Then manipulate it. Collage that until it looks right. And get that in this one too. And then let the rectilinear form inform the anthropomorphic organic form. And then I think the quickest and easiest example of the early stages of that would be the black on the end down there. That silver shape in the center was actually contact paper that I just collaged on here until I liked the way that shape sat inside the square, and it was just abstract. So that was what man made, because I cut those shapes and put them on. And then tore the contact paper off, or I painted it black actually, and then tore the contact paper off, and then let the different architectural shapes house the organic shape. So you'll see something that looks like a top cooking something else, so it doesn't matter. Inside of that, so you can see where the rectangular shape can form the organic shape. So it's considered pretty process-oriented work. I don't go to a particular idea. I let the abstraction form the idea. So then on this one, and then I moved to taking apart this piece and taking a section of it and printing it arbitrarily into one of these panels, and then create a whole new image. So I'm deconstructing a pre-existing animate, sanding the image, and letting it form another image. So by killing off something, it's a very dimension difference, and which is indicated in the old influence as well, which is the whole life cycle, sacrifice of they believe that we sacrifice a life for a better harvest, and next year cut back the volume so it looks like it's dead, get more grapes. Well, this is the benefit of that. You cut back the line, put it over there, and it makes another harvest. So it's all natural for the creative process. Out of killing off something, we get something new, which is also indicated in the 20th century history. If you've noticed, each movement is trying to kill off the prior movement. Painting becomes orthodox, so then photography and video comes in and says, painting's dead, we're more creative. And then we see video becoming things and more creative, and photography being orthodox. And then we see installation art and performance art, sort of now we even see in Chelsea, we sometimes see that we're trying to kill off aesthetics. We're trying to say we don't need compositions and form, we just need chaos, which I'm not sure we're not going to be on the backwater, but it's always challenging our traditions. Trying to reinvent or cut off rectilinear paper, pieces of paper, and I tried to collage them or move them around until they made an interesting composition. And I'll explain how I would the composition. I also took this image from the top silverware over there in London. You see, there's a piece of the block print that I took out of here, put over there. I created what I call it's titled Trojan duck. So instead of this mechanical duck device. And I did that as a painting. And then I took it over here and I made it into another block. So I took this image and I carved it and gave it more print. This is the original block print. And I transferred the painting, made another block print. Then I load it here. So it's pre-existing into this piece. And then it goes to where it is. So when I started, you can see on the video tape over there, I did it at home. Just because time-wise it would take me so much time to do it all in here, because I could only come for a week. I moved these abstract forms around. You'll see chaos up there for a while. You'll see these guys going up there for a while, and moving around until it finally came to something that I thought was much of a drawing I wasn't able to follow. But I felt, as you can see in the pictures, that it actually balanced the things that were working. And something came out that I wanted to say in the earlier class was, so I originally started with square pieces of paper, and I put them on. So I instantly had a grid on this line and this line composition. So it's already broken into a grid, which is supposed to be in a modern style. And then inside that grid, I started to line up my verticals and my horizontals. And the reason we were composing, you probably already heard this, probably want to forget it, that in our environment, psychologically, there are all this perceptual art minus perceptual tests, and then psychologically, we know our environment is rectilinear. We know that things are vertical, things are horizontal in our architecture, and that for some reason, for stability, psychologically, human beings tend to want to straighten things up. If a ladder is tipping sideways, it's going to fall over. We will go straight vertically. If a painting is perfect, we will go straight vertically. Because when anything is on a diagonal, it is perceptually in motion. It's about to fall or collapse psychologically. So we're tuned in nature to want to be vertical and horizontal to make sure things are going to fall over. But now this is often a very boring composition to do. That's all I can worry about. But if you know that, technically that in your mind, if you know that you line up horizontals and you line up verticals, then you're going to be very stable. It's not going to be much movement, it's very stable. And then if you introduce a diagonal in the composition, it's fine, but if you only have one diagonal, it's going to appear to be falling. So you should, if you want it to feel stable and you don't want to lose your viewer, you put it in a diagonal, it's a good idea to put a counter diagonal perpendicular. So it tends to stabilize. Touching, but that stabilizes. So knowing this about him, so you can create as much activity and as much spinning as you want, and you can re-stabilize it by counterbalancing it as much as you want. And you, as the artist, can determine that how much energy and movement do you want your viewer to feel, and do you want to lose them or do you want to make sure they stay in the line. So, and my desire is to get a lot of movement, but keep it a kind of slow movement so that you don't go screaming at it and you're going to fall over. So what I then do is I get all the rectilinear, abstract, man-made forms in there. I get the pre-existing block print so that it feels like it's stable. I did have some diagonals, what we call implied lines, when it picks up someplace. If it goes through here, you'll see that that diagonal, those two things actually pick up down here. So there's a diagonal here, and then I noticed before the drawing was here, there's a diagonal right here that unless I step back, I can't see it. verticals and horizontals. So let me just go through them quickly. This, of course, is a quad horizontal already with the block print. I picked up in the drawing, and I picked up this diagonal, and I have a diagonal that crosses this way. So there is a cross going through here. The big obvious one is this big black chart marker that came first. Is you'll see that this diagonal is actually, you can see that again, picked up in here, it's picked up in these guys, it's picked up in the central axis of this. And yesterday when I was drawing these guys, I noticed that I picked up in some of what I call my Cheetos, there's the same parallel diagonal going across these guys. That kind of mimics this one. So you got a whole series, you got one going through here. And then you've got all of these going through here. We're kind of lined up with this one. And that lines up with these tree trunks. So we have a series of them going all the way through here, which are pretty much perpendicular. You can see that? It's pretty subtle, but it's, and then the more I draw, the more I keep up somewhere here and somewhere implied lines. So the more I draw, it's going to be more and more finite grid. Diagonal kind of more horizontal and vertical grids. And it's going to become even more complicated as you go. Now the figure reference. Do you, maybe I should ask Ellen, have you picked up on the anthropomorphical reference in the work? Do they seem like humanoids or something? Maybe not.
Yeah, I think some of the, like the antler shapes kind of mirror like the nose or the mouth or the ears and that. A lot of time.
Yeah, I think they like yourself, I think I see it. They do seem to have, if you look at the drawings, they do seem to have a lot of the times there's a head character. You know, there's a green lizard-like thing down there. There seems to be a head. The one below it, there seems to be some kind of mechanical head. There's often a mask reference. The one in the middle of the tube here, that looks like an egg white, but it could be the eyes. So there's references to masks or heads. There's also there's a movement or a gesture that often happens like in the drawings. There's often a relationship between two characters, and it's usually blowing air into something, or sucking on something, or something, or in this case, pinching. You know, there's pinching, there's poking. So there's a kind of dialogue between not just nature and culture, but human activities, human relationships, playing, dancing. But there's often style between two characters. Or I've noticed in hindsight that when I look at this work, there's often an attachment to itself. It sort of spins in on itself. Like the top one over there, and this happens often as you look through. It's almost like you're contemplating, like when they especially contemplating your own navel. You know, you're contemplating yourself, you're looking in on yourself, and I think that character on the top is looking over its strange head and looking at its beginnings, you know, that block print at the bottom. You know, so there's this kind of looking back at the beginning, where you came from, who you are. There's that kind of dialogue that's going on. And so there's a kind of self-referential activity in these pieces. And I also see them as characters that move. And I think that's because I do the diagonals. And they do feel like they move at different paces. Some of them move very slowly, kind of walk back and forth, like this guy seems to be attached here, supported by the rotation arm, but it does seem like it could be moving very slowly. And Earlier on, if you come Thursday night system, really what there are feet, literally, and literally drawn in the pieces. And I was crippled, and laying on the line, so I shoot that bad foot, which I did surgery on. And I now said, no, it's coming into the work. It isn't having a reference to that. It's kind of the way I perceive life. It's something that looks that. Any questions? Or is there anything else I should touch on for that? They're pretty much doing straight figure? You're on the point. Like this, they're just
talk a little bit about one thing that's always an issue with drawing is how do you retain that potential for movement visually? Because when you look at the figure has to sit still for a very long time. You're ready to have a life on mind.
Well, there's several ways, and I'm thinking a lot in terms of their choices of what angle you choose to sit and do the figure. If you choose to sit and do the figure where all of their limbs are vertical and horizontal, then the movement is pretty much still. If you choose to take an angle, for example, where the limbs are at a diagonal, then there's going to be a different movement. So I think the choices you make in the way in which you often can't position the model just for yourself, but when you choose to move around the room and pick a spot, compositionally, you can pick a spot where you set up the figure with more movement. For example, if you have someone sitting doing a portrait, the legs crossed, okay, hand up here, hand down here, you're going to get arms are very directional. You're going to figure in. You often, if you look at the figure, it's often limbs, legs and arms, go to the head and go back out the other arm. So if you have your arms straight out, your direction is going to be right off the page. If you have an S curve like this, you have this kind of thing happening through the composition. You have the legs across. I think David Moore is a great person. He has the diagonal counter diagonal set up. He's got his character leaning, his figure leaning with the counterbalance, and maybe this leg across, so you have the counter perpendicular. So there's also some things you can set up in the pose. There's also line quality that can create movement. If you do a kind of twitchy, repetitive searching like Giacometti's drawings, he draws figures, he will like redraw that border edge. So that gives you an indication of the person's got twitches, and they're about ready to shake right off the page. So you can, because every time you repeat a line, it suggests memory. It suggests that the figure was over here, and now the figure's over here. So if you have that kind of gestural style, where you're just searching out where that line is supposed to go, then your figure's going to be looking like this one like this, which is neat too. So you can sort of do it by the way in which you draw, or by just some kind of positioning of the figure. Yeah, repetitive one is a big thing. It's repetitive one. That gets to stylistic. Maybe they're not really for stylistic choices. Yeah. So,
Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned foreshortening and that idea of how these you constructed, you talked about constructing sort of grid, and then talk about placing them sort of connect certain space.
like what I said about that over there, when I constructed the grid.
But here it's like you constructed a space for these characters.
Right.
But here,
Right.
you're applying a grid up and people is making things still and static, right, or flat.
Right.
A lot of
Right.
modernists is really flat. But you're using the grid as your and a structure that you're breaking that flatness.
Right. Right. And then it introduces the form as well. And in the figure, I think it could be the structure of the room, the structure of space. because if you end up just adding a figure and sticking them in the middle of the page, I'm sure you've heard this already, there's this tendency that we just kind of get so into doing a figure that it's kind of blunt on another page, and all the negative space does is talk or do anything. And I always say to the students, think about if you took a pair of scissors and you cut the figure out of that piece of paper, and you drop it on the floor, all of it is on the floor. Would those negative shapes be interesting, or would they be what we call dumb shapes, boring, straight, not so articulated shape? And if that's the case, then you have to think more when you're setting up your figure, pose of the figure, what is going to happen to a negative space? Should the figure almost be touching all four corners so that when you cut it out and make a puzzle out of it, is each shape going to be interesting? When you set it up, can you have an arm up someplace so it's actually horizontal? So it mimics the horizontal of the page. Can you set things up so that you can apply horizontals and apply verticals? And then it can be the chair with the arms on, and it can be a window in the back. It creates the horizontal going across. So there's all of those things that puts the figure in place, or context, that can also compose the image. And then it can be that grid. You can use the architectural structure as a grid in which a figure in here.
Because I noticed in the small paintings, you're definitely using the edge. They're big figures in fairly confined space.
And they always talk or poke toward the edge of the piece. And I learned that from the collage of the rectangles over there, that your form shouldn't be arbitrarily in a square or rectangle. It should actually either be poking the corners or pushing against the sides or doing something. And so when I started composing a square, which is really hard to do, each thing had to sort of be entering or exiting from a corner and or poking down or entering another space. Like there's a tentacle that will sort of wrap around in a skinny space that already pre-exists. That everything should be talking to each other or facing off against each other, but not either arbitrarily. And I do see these, we talked earlier about this, I do see these sort of like portraits. Because really I'm talking about one character or maybe two characters facing off, but they're more like portraits and not so much in a landscape environment. A little water starts to appear or a little horizon, but in most cases, in all my earlier work was floating bulbous forms that really were floating in space. Now, in the last series of things, was another 8 paintings after this. These characters have been glued into something that becomes a landscape. So all of a sudden I'm moving my portraits into what I put on my portraits, into a landscape, which then gives it more narrative. It gives it, you move around in the space, you see more activities, you see the fence, you see water, you see trees back there. You start to create your own story. And I'm really interested in being more direct, and I'm more interested in setting you up to have your own ending. So I sort of see just the changing of the space. So for you all, where you place the figure is going to change whether or not it's about the figure or about the space in which the figure is sitting or the story in which the figure is participating. And so there are different levels of where you place it. The place is pretty important.
When you start on these small drawings, it seems like these organic figures and spontaneously going out of a little piece, but how much of it is like
The only thing that's sort of, it's planned out